1 hour. Our plea will be if you could try to just condense your submissions, your highlights, because you have got submissions here. We want to see if we can complete this matter by latest 5 o'clock. So this is Dr. Eboso, isn't it? Do you think you can do in about half an hour?
My Lord, I don't think I can do in half an hour, but I can see the timer reads 50 minutes. I will try and compress the...
45?
I will try.
You try?
Yes.
Let's do 45, please, if you can. I'll be very obliged.
Thank you very much, my Lord. Let me begin by introducing myself. My name is Dr. Eboso. I'm a medical doctor, and I'm humbled to stand before you and present. I wish to start by referring all of us to the Constitution of Kenya, because that will form much of my authority today. And I will start with the preamble, the third line of the preamble, which reads, "Proud of our ethnic, cultural, and religious diversity, and determined to live in peace and unity, as one indivisible sovereign nation." And then the sixth line also, that is recognizing the aspirations of all Kenyans for a government based on the essential values of human rights, equality, freedom, democracy, social justice, and the rule of law. And then...
and just for record purposes, please indicate your respondent number.
72nd respondent.
Okay, thank you.
254 Hope, and I'm appearing in person.
Thank you.
And then the seventh, exercising our sovereign and inalienable right to determine the form of governance of our country, and having participated fully in the making of this constitution, adopt, enact, and give to ourselves this constitution. And then Article 1, that all sovereign power belongs to the people of Kenya and shall be exercised only in accordance with this constitution. The people may exercise their sovereign power either directly or through their democratically elected representatives, and that sovereign power under this constitution is delegated to the following state organs, not people, but the following state organs, which shall perform their functions in accordance with this constitution. It goes ahead to list them. Article 2, that this constitution is the supreme law of the republic and binds all persons and all state organs at both levels of government, and that no person may exercise state authority except as authorized under this constitution. Therefore, no person may claim or exercise state authority except as authorized under this constitution. The validity or legality of this constitution is not subject to challenge by or before any court or state organ, and that any law, including customary law, that is inconsistent with this constitution is void to the extent of the inconsistency, and any act or omission in contravention is invalid. Article 3, every person has an obligation to respect, uphold, and defend this constitution. That's every person. And that any attempt to establish a government otherwise than in compliance with this constitution is unlawful. Article 10, the national values and principles of governance in this article bind all state organs, state officers, public officers, and all persons whenever any of them applies or interprets this constitution, enacts, applies, or interprets any law, or makes or implements public policy decisions. Public policy decisions. And then it goes to list the national values, and the ones that I'm interested in are good governance, integrity, transparency, and accountability, and perhaps national unity, rule of law, democracy, and participation of the people. Article 47 on the rights to fair administrative action. That states that every person has the right to administrative action that is expeditious, efficient, lawful, reasonable, and procedurally fair. If a right, and that's where I'm interested, if a right or fundamental freedom of a person has been or is likely to be adversely affected by administrative action, the person has the right to be given written reasons for the action. And Parliament shall enact legislation to give effect to these rights in clause 1. And Parliament did enact the Fair Administrative Action Act 2015, which defined an administrative action. I want us to go to Article 129 which provides for executive authority and the principles. And I'm interested in one, that executive authority derives from the people of Kenya and shall be exercised only in accordance with this constitution. The Article 131, and I'm interested in clause 2, the president shall promote and enhance national unity and safeguard the sovereignty of the republic. Those are the ones that I'm interested in. And then Article 259, that this constitution shall be interpreted in a manner that, I'm interested in A, promotes its purposes, values, and principles, and 2, if there is a conflict between different languages version of this constitution, the English language version prevails. And then I think that is about it. And then the 6th schedule of section 7 of the 6th schedule, which talks of all law in force immediately before the effective date continues in force and shall be construed with the alterations, adaptations, qualifications, and exceptions necessary to bring it into conformity with this constitution. My lords, the issues that have been raised in this appeal touch, in our opinion as 2540, on two main issues. That is the sovereignty, the concept of sovereignty, and the concept of supremacy of the Constitution as a law. And I'll talk about sovereignty, although I'll refer you to page 2463 of volume 6 of the Record of Appeal, the Attorney General's Record of Appeal, volume 6, page 2463, where our submissions at the lower court, at the High Court, on sovereignty were, so that I don't have to talk much about it. And that the Constitution requires that, or has provided, that the people are the owners of sovereignty and that they can exercise it directly or indirectly, so that there are two exercises of sovereignty. One is direct and another is a delegated exercise. Not a delegated power, but a delegated exercise of sovereign authority. And the Constitution has also created the aspect of delegated power. Sovereign power, once delegated, is no longer sovereign. It is delegated power, and it is inherently limited by the Constitution, in the sense that by the nature of delegated power and the principles of delegation of power, even contained in Article 94, where we get glimpses of how delegated authority works, delegated power is inherently limited and has to be limited. So we have those two versions. There are different manifestations of sovereign power and different different capacities of sovereign power. The fact that the people exercise sovereign power directly, what are the ways in which they exercise sovereign power directly under our Constitution? They may exercise it through voting. That is, when you go to vote, no one can ask you to vote a certain way, or no one can question your vote, because it's sovereign power, but it's exercised at an individual level. But that is a separate capacity. For instance, when we are electing the president, for instance, the sovereign power necessary for electing the presidency is not just your individual capacity of sovereignty, but a different capacity. And I think that's a distinction we need to make. I view sovereignty as, for those who are Christians, as something sort of like the Trinity, where you have God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. They are all sovereign, but then they have different capacities of sovereignty. And that's how we need to view sovereignty. And it may answer the question of who are the people. That the people is you and me, but the people is also the people collectively. And I'll explain as we go on. Supremacy of the Constitution as a law, and what I want to demonstrate on this one is that there is an inherent non-absoluteness of any law where there is a supreme law. Such that when you have a supreme law, any other law cannot be deemed to be absolutely binding. It will only be binding to the extent that it is consistent with the supreme law. And that's the same for sovereignty, that as long as you have a sovereign, anything else below that will never have an absolute bond. I'll take 10 minutes to talk about the cross-appeal issues, and they will relate to this. And the cross-appeal issues that we had were that, number one, we wanted the Superior Court to declare that certain proposed amendments were unlawful because they were not consistent with provisions of the Constitution. And here I want to make a distinction between a proposal to amend the Constitution, as was in this case, and an amendment under the amendment process itself. That the task forces had initially proposed to amend the constitution. These were proposals. And proposals, because they are coming from the executive, which can only exercise authority that is delegated and as authorized by the constitution, are subject to all the other limitations of all executive authority. That includes Article 47, they must give reasons, the reasons must be rational, they must be justified, and they must, the proposal must be necessary. And we try to persuade the court using Article 10 of the Constitution, the rule of law, accountability and transparency, and Article 47. We presented a document labeled CE5, and we'll find the documents from page 2422 to 2447, together with an affidavit where we were able to break down all the individual amendments and show the ones that were irrational or that seemed irrational to us, the ones that were unjustified, and the ones that were not necessitated. Rationality being that if you're solving a problem, the solution has to be consistent with the problem. It has to relate rationally to the problem you're trying to solve. A necessitated amendment is one where you have actually either there was no other way to solve this amendment, to solve the problem, and that is why you opted for a constitutional amendment, to propose a constitutional amendment. And a justified amendment is one which there are reasons stated for that amendment, that either the people asked for it or that there was a problem you are trying to solve. But you cannot come from nowhere and arbitrarily give us a proposal and claim that it cannot be questioned. Having demonstrated that, we wished that the Superior Court state that some of the provisions in the proposal, some of the proposals by the task force were irrational and not necessitated and unjustified, and therefore should be scraped off, or that the Attorney General be directed to review and have only those that meet the edicts to go through. And a specific example that I would want to give is an amendment on IEBC. That is found in the page 2457 of volume 6. And it talks about the restructuring of IEBC in the proposed amendments. And it doesn't give reasons anywhere why they were restructuring IEBC, or rather, whatever they were proposing to do was to reconstitute, not to restructure. They said the reason is they want to restructure, but they started reconstituting. And the manner in which they were doing it is that they were recommending a vetting process for the IEBC commissioners as they are. They never showed any minute that citizens asked that these commissioners be vetted. They never demonstrated that there was a necessity for that, and that the already provided provision in the Constitution had been attempted and failed. And thirdly, therefore it was not justified. It was not justified. And it is thinkable that the proposal was actually a bill of attainder, in the sense that it was really targeting these IEBC commissioners, because this was a cut and dry kind of exercise, that it will only apply to these particular ones, and after that, the other provisions of the current constitutions will go on. And we thought that that was irrational and needed to be justified. We finally were asking for the use of public funds to be on a popular initiative. That is, once a popular initiative is begun, that public funds on public resources, not funds, public resources ought not to be used. However, we have to draw a distinction between public resources and public funds, because public resources include public funds, but public resources even include the portfolio, such that you cannot you cannot claim to be, rather public resources include public funds, but public resources include the portfolio and include the bureaucratic machinery. And we were asking the court to declare that in a move to amend the Constitution by a popular initiative, public resources may not be used, including the public platform and whatnot. We demonstrated through a letter from the PS of Sports directing that signatures be collected, and that letter is found in volume 6, page 2444, directing that the junior staff facilitate the collection of signatures in support of the amendment, and that is use of public resources. It may not be use of public funds or public finances, but it is use of public resources, and that is not proper. The use of public resources may proceed even beyond the point of initiating where the amendment has reached the level of a referendum. And being a political process, it should not really benefit from that. And there are reasons why a popular initiative should not be supported by public funds. One, a constitution is there for the control of government. If we are going to allow government to use public resources to pursue an amendment, then we will end up with a constitution that has been amended, or we will defeat the difficulty in amendment that is entrenched in our constitution. It defeats that inherent difficulty, and amendment is a political process. And if we are not going to allow public resources to be used when an individual is running for office, political office, to support their campaign, then we cannot support a political process like an amendment to the constitution with public resources, because you will be disenfranchising and using part of the resources of those who even oppose that process without authority. And then what is good for the goose is good for the gander. Next time, if this time we are going to allow the government to use public resources to support or promote a popular initiative at any stage, then what we are doing, we are implicitly allowing it to oppose a popular initiative later. And that should not be allowed, because then it will beat the very essence of why we have a popular initiative. I wish to respond to the appeals, and I think I'm quite on time. I'll start with the basic structure doctrine and the unconstitutional, which is related to the doctrine of constitutional amendment. And I will simply define it majorly to the members of the public and members of our organization who are probably listening. That the basic structure doctrine is a judicial doctrine, which means it's a law. It's a judicial doctrine which grants review powers to a court, that judicial review power over the substance of an amendment on the basis that the amending authority has exceeded their power to amend by changing a fundamental part of the Constitution, where such a change amounts to replacing the Constitution. It is considered, yes.
Can you please tell us where that definition is from?
That is my understanding of the basic structure doctrine. And that's why I said I'll simplify it from what I have my reading and understanding of the basic structure doctrine. That a constitutional amendment happens and it is procedural. However, the court is able to review the substance of the amendment on the basis that the amending authority lacks the capacity to amend, to cause such an amendment, because it is so fundamental it amounts to replacing the Constitution. Now, I put the substance, that is, it's a substantive review, in quotes, because I do not believe it's a substantive review, as the appellants have argued. Because once there is a procedure to amend, the procedure sort of precludes that the amending authority has capacity. There can be no proper procedure if there is no competence. So competence is actually part of the procedure. And the only reason the court is looking at the substance is to ascertain that the person who amended is competent. It is not looking to review or substitute its opinion with the substance of the amendment. It is really a procedural. Therefore, the question that it's not judiciable because it's a substantive review of an amendment, which is sort of a limitation of sovereign authority, I don't think that should be the case. What are the elements of this basic structure doctrine? One, it's judicial review power over, in quote unquote, the substance, and that the amending authority must be incapable of such an amendment, because they're not the ones who exercise constituent power, that is the constitution making power. And usually there is no explicit limitation on the powers of the amending, the purported amending authority. Normally, the amending authority that is incapable of such amendments because it's either, now in the context of our constitution, it would either be exercising delegated authority, purely delegated authority, or it would be exercising the indirect exercise of delegated power, that is by dint of the preamble. Because the preamble, as I read, the preamble tells us that it is the people who have the sovereign and inalienable right to determine the form of governance of our country, and having participated fully in the making of this constitution. Then what it means is that this particular authority, either it is not sovereign or it does not meet the whatever the preamble tells us about the quality of the people when they are making the constitution. That is, they are sovereign, they are exercising their inalienable right, and have participated fully. Is the basic structure doctrine good law? We would look at it in form of the text and the application. And in form of the text, we would be asking ourselves, does it conform to the principles of our constitution? One, it seems on the face of it to be a limitation on amendment power, or to be a limitation on power that has been delegated, that is constituted power. And that is really the basis of constitutionalism. And therefore, from that view, it looks to be good law, because it is really promoting constitutionalism and whatnot. On the applicability of that law, or on the application of that law, we look at how it was applied in India and contrast it with how it was applied in the Ringera case that I think has been mentioned over and over during this appeal. In India, there is no express limitation to amendment power of parliament. There is no express limitation. And what the court did in Kesavananda and Minerva, and I think mainly Kesavananda and Minerva Mills, is that the court construed that itself it has the power to limit, and this is from the fact that there is a higher power and parliament is not that higher power, therefore it cannot destroy the constitution. And further, it defined the limitation. That is, it defined what amounts to the basic structure, because it is not defined in the Indian constitution. What this ended up doing, it created an inconsistency. And you'll find even from the ruling, the judges themselves could not agree on what amounts to the basic structure. Even in Minerva Mills, when they had a similar matter, they still could not agree on what amounts to the basic structure. This created an inconsistency. The second thing is that it made the Supreme Court have unlimited power, because there was no standard of determining what is the basic structure. So a Supreme Court sitting today could decide this is the basic structure, and another one tomorrow could decide this is the basic structure. While the transfer, it looked like a limitation on parliamentary power to amend, but then it was actually transferring the exercise of sovereignty from parliament to the judiciary, because now the judiciary would be the one to determine what can constitute the basic structure and therefore is amendable, and what cannot, and when. Because if another court sits 10 years later, it would probably arrive at a different conclusion. And this is bad, because it boils down the whole question of constitutional change to the opinion of a group of judges without a standard. And two, it is subjective and impermanent. And you can imagine an amendment passing today and a similar amendment 5 years later being questioned in court and failing. And that would mean that we would essentially be questioning the legitimacy of that previous amendment and whatnot. Therefore, to the extent that it created, it was making the court to become supreme, because nobody could define, and only the court could define what the basic structure is. It was actually, it would actually be deemed to be not promoting constitutionalism, because it is just a transfer of power merely from parliament to the courts. The other thing is that the court said those parts are unamendable, absolutely. Why? Because the Indian constitution did not provide for, at least expressly, for the direct exercise of the constituent power by the people, and therefore it practically made those unamendable. And to that extent, it extinguished the concept of sovereignty and transferred it to the court, because it was now the court that would determine. In Kenya, on the other hand, Justice Ringera solved these two problems, and this is how Justice Ringera solved it: by providing for a referendum. By providing for a referendum, what the court was doing is it was limiting Parliament's power, but limiting its own power too, such that it was extinguishing the aspect of unamendability by recognizing that there is a sovereign, and the sovereign can determine whether such things could be amended or not amended. And that is consistent with constitutionalism, that there is no delegated power that will have absolute power. The second thing is that where in the theory of delegation of authority, where the delegate finds that they are unable, that they are unable to perform the task that has been delegated to them, the proper way to go about it is to refer it back to the delegator. And that is what the Ringera judgment was doing. at the time, we did not have a provision for the direct exercise of amendment power. And that meant that any exercise of sovereignty could be considered to be an exercise of constituent power. And I think that is why the referendum was the first thing, because at the time, the only exercise of sovereignty that seemed directly related to the Constitution was the power of the people to vote. And I place myself in the position of Justice Ringera and the team, and by referring the issue to a referendum, it was the only exercise of sovereignty that was construable at the time. Therefore, the judicial review power was actually limited because now it was subject to a sovereign, although the judicial power could still determine what is a basic structure, but that power was limited because still an amendment can be done. And two, the sovereignty of the people was upheld and was not usurped. And this was because the people had not provided for a guide of how they will directly exercise their sovereignty within the Constitution, at least their constituent power within the Constitution. Now, the people in and this was happening, the context where this was happening was when we were trying to review the Constitution, and up to the time when we got to the 2010 Constitution, this was very much alive in the framers of the Constitution, and therefore they could see the challenges that the basic structure as applied elsewhere had brought, and they could see the challenges that Justice Ringera team had in providing for whatever it had to provide. And therefore, while framing our Constitution, Kenyans decided that they are going to define the basic structure, and they did so in Article 255. And from our submissions, you'll see that I used the example of Article 10 to show that these things that comprise the basic structure in Article 255 have certain characteristics in them. And I agree with the advocate, Ian, who said that they are foundational, that you look at the Constitution and it's almost like they are there even before the Constitution. Secondly, they are cross-cutting. You look at the Constitution, you'll find them in Chapter 1, Chapter 2, Chapter 3, Chapter 6, Chapter 11. And thirdly, they are universal. The things in 255, you'll find them in multiple other constitutions. The 2010 Constitution recognized the challenges of the basic structure doctrine as applied and tried to solve them. Does it apply in Kenya? Being a law that existed prior to the 2010 Constitution, Section 7 of the 6th Schedule tells us how a prior law can be considered as applicable in the country. And it tells us that it is applicable as long as it is construed in the manner that makes it consistent and conform to our Constitution. And so it is applicable with certain modifications. One, we have defined our basic structure in the Constitution. Therefore, judicial power does not have any authority to start redefining it because we have expressly stated it there. Number two, there is the existence of a substantive limitation to parliamentary power. That is different from how it has traditionally been applied. Third, the constitutional supremacy is a limitation to judicial power. That while in India or while prior, it could be applied that the judicial power could overlook the supremacy of the Constitution and declare and even attempt to adjudicate a power outside of the Constitution. The Constitution has declared that it is supreme. Therefore, you are not able to adjudicate over a power above the Constitution, and the court's eyes are limited to the supremacy of the Constitution. The people have declared their sovereignty, and they have provided for their direct exercise of this sovereignty in the Constitution. That therefore extinguishes the whole concept of unamendability or absolute unamendability, eternity clauses, because the people have provided. We own the sovereignty and we can exercise it directly. So the question that then comes up is the referendum the full manifestation of the people's sovereignty? And we'll compare this to the Ringera case. As I said, Justice Ringera and the team had no express guide to what constituted the constitutional sovereignty, or what constituted the sovereignty, and what and any court that is established under a constitutional framework such as ours cannot really adjudicate on a power that is above the sovereignty, above the supremacy of the Constitution. If the Constitution tells you that this is the law that is supreme, then you cannot adjudicate over a law that is superior to that and still remain a court under that Constitution. That you may only recognize that there is a power above the Constitution, but then you may not adjudicate over how much of that power is adequate and whatnot. And that's what I was trying to say. And so even a referendum then would constitute a manifestation of sovereignty. And as I said, there are different levels of sovereignty. There is a greater sovereign and a lesser sovereign based on the capacity. So a referendum was a sovereign and could not be questioned at the time. And so that is what we did. Post 2010, the people have defined in the preamble the kind of sovereignty that is enough, if I should call it that, to make a constitution. And this sovereignty is in exercising our sovereign and inalienable right to determine and so on and so forth, and having participated fully in the making of the constitution. Therefore, the sovereignty required to make a constitution, which is making a constitution here is changing the constitution in such a way that you're remaking it, is a sovereignty that has the most a robust participation of the people. And to that extent, I agree with the Superior Court. Therefore, the manifestation within the Constitution, because remember Article 1 has said that, Article 2, that the people can exercise their sovereignty directly. Under this Constitution, they can exercise it directly. Therefore, we will look for the direct exercise of sovereignty within the Constitution that gives us the most robust manifestation of participation, full participation of the people. And that will be the primary constituent power for us, because we can't look outside of the Constitution. There is an absurdity with conflating a referendum with the primary constituent power, as the appellants would want us to believe. And this is it. A referendum is essentially a general election, only that it's an issue-based general election, because it's everybody participating, and there are a bit of minimum criteria required, but for all practical purposes, it's like the election of the president. So if we are saying that a referendum, merely a referendum, is what gives legitimacy to our constitution, what that tells us is that in a case like our constitution, which in the referendum garnered 66%, and in the last election, the president, I think, got 98%. Then it would mean the president has more legitimacy than that amendment or the Constitution itself. That cannot be it. Therefore, while the sovereignty involved in election of a president seems similar in that one of a referendum, the exercise of sovereignty that gives us the Constitution is a greater sovereignty, if I should say that. Is a greater one, and it's the other part of full participation that grants it that extra legitimacy. There is a downside to democracy, and I think I've attached in my bundle of authorities on page 75. There is a book titled Theories of Democracy by Cunningham. I forget the other name, and he talks about the inherent weaknesses of democracy. That is, democracy can be irrational. Democracy can actually be, it can hide a tyrannical rule by the majority. It can hide various other problems. And think, maybe let me just list them for the record. On page 75 of the bundle of authorities, that democracy can lead to an ineffective government, and he describes how it can. It can lead to a tyranny of the majority. It can lead to the massification of culture and morals. It can lead to conflict. It can lead to demagogy and the empty space of democracy. And the LSK chair talked about the rise of Adolf Hitler. It can mask oppressive rule. And so, and it can be irrational because people act on the spur of the moment. And those are inherent weaknesses of democracy that led us to actually found the idea of written constitutionalism. It was to check those inherent weaknesses of democracy. Of course, even the constitution cannot really itself limit democracy per se, but then democracy on realizing, or the people on realizing these inherent weaknesses of democracy, decided to pre-commit and guide their exercise of sovereignty. Not limit, but guide it for purposes of order and efficiency. And therefore, we cannot relegate a question like a constitutional question to be decided on a referendum, one referendum that is subject to all these weaknesses. There is an error in an extra-constitutional constituent power as advanced by the High Court. There are several errors that will make it inconsistent with our Constitution. As I said, Article 1 provides that there is the direct exercise of sovereign power by the people, and this Constitution has provided for it. Therefore, to construe an extra-constitutional exercise, what you'll be doing, you'll be disregarding Article 1. Number 2, Article 2 talks of the supremacy of the Constitution, but it also says that any claim to authority under this Constitution or any exercise of state authority must be authorized. Article 3, in defense of the Constitution, outlaws the establishment of any government outside of this Constitution, except as authorized under this Constitution. Therefore, to claim that we can set up a constitutional, sort of like an extra-constitutional framework to form another government would be unlawful in its very nature. Therefore, we can't do that under this Constitution. We cannot do that. No government entity, because the four-step process that the Superior Court suggested, civic education, public participation, constituent assembly, debates, and finally a referendum, would be organized in some way. They have to be organized. Who is this that will be organizing it? Is it Wanjiku? It has to be state machinery the way the 2010 Constitution was organized. And if it is state machinery, on what authority will they be doing that? What authority will they be using our taxes to organize that? What will have authorized that? Therefore, no government entity which exercises delegated authority under this Constitution can act except as authorized. So who will be doing this? Our courts are established within the context of this Constitution. They cannot adjudicate over an extra-constitutional exercise of sovereignty. What will be the standard through which the court will, if at all, through which a court will adjudicate over disputes relating to that exercise of sovereignty? The primary constituent power, therefore, has to be construed within the Constitution as it is, and in our view, it is contained in the popular initiative to amend. How? Here, all the state activity that happens within a popular initiative is tightly regulated. County assemblies can't change the document. Parliament cannot, in fact, Parliament cannot even veto it. And the IEBC is bound in how it will conduct and is limited anyway. Therefore, all their actions are subject to judicial review and they are bound by the Constitution. And the Constitution itself has provided for how these county assemblies will exercise their power as and still provided for public participation within it. The collection of 1 million signatures suggests an unenforceable but yet mandatory sort of like civic education, because you have to get 1 million registered voters to endorse that I have read, I have understood, and I support. And that will be verified by an independent body. That tells you that by the time you're getting 1 million registered voters as a Wanjiku or as a citizen and not the state, you will have really mandatorily had to go and spread the good message of the new Constitution. Only the people can suggest a fundamental change to the delegating tool. That is, by a popular initiative, the government cannot be involved. Only the people. Therefore, it's a people process. The people themselves suggest. It goes for purposes of the Constituent Assembly. It may go to the county assemblies. And indeed, in France, their constitution was established by a Constituent Assembly, which served for the rest of the term as the National Assembly. Same to the South African story and many other places where a Constituent Assembly is the one it's elected and is the one that, even in India, that acts as the National Assembly. Therefore, these people are already elected and we have already provided the mechanism through which they can act as a Constituent Assembly. The National Assembly is a further Constituent Assembly with mandatory provisions in Article 118 for public participation. And then finally, we have a referendum. There is no other direct exercise of sovereign power within our Constitution that has this much participation of the people, where the people initiate and the people approve. Therefore, for all intents and purposes, this is what should be construed as the primary constituent power. But primary constituent power can also be exercised outside the Constitution. It's not mandatory that it has to be outside the Constitution. It is not bound by the Constitution, but it can still be exercised within the Constitution. And I think that is the one that our courts and any state organ has authority to adjudicate over. The use of Article 255 on parliamentary initiative, that's what you may ask. The parliamentary initiative also employs Article 255. What then is the remit of that? The remit of that is that there can be a change to the basic structure and there can be a change of the basic structure. A change to the basic structure can be done by parliament, but then they have to seek approval from the people in a referendum. A change of the basic structure, which now amounts to remaking the constitution, has to go through the whole process of the popular initiative. Okay, I'll go to the remit of a popular initiative, and in the interest of time, I will first of all just answer a few questions. Did the president initiate the popular initiative? One, we cannot conflate proposing and initiation. Initiative, there are two in the Constitution, a parliamentary and a presidential initiative. Merely thinking about an amendment is not initiating. Merely proposing, if the president were working with the deputy president and proposed to them, I think we need a constitutional amendment, that's not an initiative. Therefore, I do not believe that the president, for as long as he is not the one who collected 1 million signatures and took them to IEBC, and the IEBC verified, then he did not initiate a popular initiative. He made proposals for an amendment, and we will, that's where we start. We have to distinguish the two. But then the president can only even make those proposals as authorized. And if there is no authority even to propose or to propose it to the people, because we find authority in how the president can propose it to parliament, can make that proposal to parliament through the various opening of parliament and the reports that he gives to parliament. He can issue them with the report of the Building Bridges Task Force, and then a parliamentary initiative can be initiated. But there is no authority for how the president will initiate or will propose an amendment to the people. And nevertheless, was this a popular initiative? It may be considered a popular initiative, but from what has been gathered is that it was impure. It was, the whole process was proposed by the state. And a popular initiative in its definition has to be done outside of the state, independent of the state by its definition. And you'll find that in my submissions and the authorities that I quoted in the submissions. Can it now become a popular initiative? No, it is already impure. It cannot be a popular initiative even now. The fact that it was proposed by the government. Can a state officer or president initiate a popular initiative? With authority, yes, and the only authority that can be given would be from the Constitution, not anywhere else, because the Constitution has only provided for two. But then they can, in their private capacity. I reject the idea that the president loses rights when he becomes, personal rights, when he becomes president. The president is also part of the people. And as long as he does it in his personal capacity, it's okay. He will face the same challenges as Wanjiku, as long as the state resources are not employed. Because when he does it in his private capacity, there are no state resources that will be employed. And therefore, he will have the very same difficulty that Wanjiku has. And if it's any easier for him, it's because he's already a politician and he's known. And that is a private advantage. It was not conferred by the presidency. In fact, he's president because he already had it. I want to go to the issue of IEBC and quorum, and this relates to the supremacy of the Constitution. Supremacy of a law is both the text of the law, the purpose of the law, and the meaning of the law. Gives the law supremacy. Such that when we say the Constitution is supreme, it's both its purposes and the text. It's not just the text. Such that if there is any other law that in its application conflicts with the purpose of the Constitution, then that law will be invalid to that extent. And if we only look at text, we will get it wrong. A law is its purpose, and that's why I read for us Article 260, that the Constitution cannot have intended that a fully constituted commission cannot do the work that the Constitution intended. That once it has 3 commissioners, then the purpose for which it has been formed is to do a certain thing because it's fully constituted. Especially because we never provided that Parliament comes up with further legislation on that. Therefore, the Constitution intended that a fully constituted commission can function. However, Parliament in its wisdom made a law that was textually consistent, and that's fine. in its application, it was consistent until when a constitutional duty calls. And now, IEBC cannot perform a constitutional duty because Parliament imposed a limitation on it that the Constitution did not. Then the purpose of the Constitution will defeat the purpose of the Act. And that, for me, I submit that, one, the lack of quorum, if at all it is merely because of the legislative provision, cannot remove a constitutional imperative. On the issue of verifying an amendment, an and a is an indefinite article in English. An indefinite article meaning that it does not define. It can be one, it can be many. And an, actually, it is actually, if you check in the dictionary, Merriam-Webster dictionary, another definition of a and an when used as an indefinite article is any. And there are various places in the Constitution where the Constitution has said a, like a county assembly, a bill may be proposed in Parliament. That doesn't mean one bill. So we cannot restrict the fact that it said an amendment to mean one amendment. Two, what is the historical meaning of an amendment in Kenya? In Kenya, we have had amendments before, and they were framed as an amendment to the Constitution. And they were far-reaching, and they were accepted, and by the theory of recognition of law, they were recognized and practiced. And by the time we were writing an amendment to the Constitution may be proposed, we had that history. Our meaning of an amendment involved as far as it can go, as long as there is capacity to do that. Is an amendment the text, the issue, or the meaning? That's the third thing. If I were to, for instance, change the name of counties if I were to change the name of counties to Congress, if I were to propose such an amendment, we want to change the name of our counties to Congresses, county assemblies to Congresses, I would have to change so many parts of the Constitution. Would that constitute many amendments, or would it be one? And that is the Pandora's box that we open when we start dissecting the question of what is an amendment. I think it is an unnecessary limitation on the sovereignty of the people. And essentially because nothing stops anyone, any citizen, from starting their own amendment. Such that because there are no public resources used in the initiation, if at all there are no public resources used in the initiation, then nothing stops them from starting their own popular initiative and sorting out the things they don't want in the other initiative and putting the ones they want, and then putting it to the people. Let's not unnecessarily limit someone who is not using public resources to do this thing, to propose this amendment. I want to talk about immunity, and I would please ask that I be...
No, your time is up, Mr. Traiboso. You've done very well so far.
My Lord, I had already... I'll take 5 minutes. It's so important that I talk about this, my Lord.
No, I will request that you take a maximum of 2 minutes, precisely okay. 2.
There are instances in the Constitution where immunity is mentioned. One is the immunity of judges, commissioners, and that is Article 160, 259, 143, and Article 2. And there are only 2 instances where the immunity is immunity from proceedings. And that is Article 2 and the immunity of the president. That tells you that the immunity that the president enjoys is not the functional immunity like other officials. The president enjoys more than that. He enjoys sovereign immunity. And that has been there since 1963. We never changed it in the new constitution. The only thing we added was that, one, we now protect both the person and the people and the person and the office itself from proceedings. If we were to go with what the court said is that we would defeat the purpose of even Article 143.3, and I think you will see that in my submission. And immunity is not impunity, there is impeachment, and at the end of the term, the president is actually liable and whatnot. On the issue of Chapter 6, Chapter 6 is very important because it is not a question of law. You can violate the law and still be an ethical person. And still on immunity, the president has power to interpret the Constitution. Anyone who applies the Constitution has to interpret it. So by saying that by the president violating the Constitution, he therefore loses immunity, it is to say that when the president exercises his function of interpreting the Constitution and interprets wrongly, he loses immunity. I think that is not right. The president wears 2 vests, one inside for functional immunity and the other one is outside, a cloak of sovereign immunity. And when he is president and performing the functions of president, he has the sovereign immunity. When he leaves that office, he may retain the functional immunity, which now is not immune to proceedings, and proceedings may go. I hope that answers Councillor Counsel Dudley's question that the immunity the president has right now is immunity from proceedings. After that, he's immune from only liability, and that's different. Chapter 6 is a question of ethics, and we have established...
Dr.
My Lord, I had 5 seconds.
Also, your time is up. The last thing I want you to just tell Kenyans is, and you've done very well, by the way, thank you. You represent 254 Hope. Who is 254 Hope?
Oh, 254 Hope is an organization not registered, but it's an organization of young people, young professionals, doctors, lawyers, architects, and we have a few engineers and a few teachers. And what we are concerned with is we want to advance good governance in the country. We feel that the direction the country has been taking is wrong, and essentially what is going to happen is we'll be the ones who pay the price later on. So we decided to start organizing ourselves and hoping that we'll be able to change the country and put it in the right direction.
Okay, thank you very much.